There is a box at the edge of everything. Not a metaphorical box, not the kind of box that belongs in philosophy lectures or mythology seminars. A real box in Tolkien's cosmology, with walls, with a lock, with something on the other side of the lock that has been pressing against it from within since before the Third Age began, before the Second Age, before the sundering of Beleriand, before the Noldor came back across the ice, before most of the things that the mythology treats as ancient history had even happened yet. The box is the void, the lock is the door of night, and the thing inside it is Morgoth. Most people who love Tolkien spend their energy on Sauron, the Eye of Barad-dûr, the One Ring, the Nazgul riding through autumn fog, the slow, grinding, civilizational pressure of a will that has been bending the world toward its own ends for thousands of years. Sauron is terrifying enough that spending your analytical energy there feels entirely justified. But Tolkien was explicit about the latter. He was not subtle about it and did not ask his readers to infer it. Sauron was a lieutenant, a servant, the most gifted servant, the most dangerous servant, the servant who had grown so enormously in his master's absence that he had built an empire and almost conquered the world. But a servant, the shadow of something else's shadow. Morgoth was the original. And he's behind a door that has been sealed for 6,000 years. A door that was sealed at the end of the War of Wrath, the last time the Valar marched directly into Middle-earth, the conflict that drowned an entire continent and reshaped the geography of the world in the winning. A door that Tolkien in his letters in the unpublished mythology, in the prophecy, spent decades trying to decide whether to commit to, left explicitly open to the possibility of one day no longer holding. The question we are following tonight is this: what if the War of the Ring was when that door cracked? Not when it opened fully, not when Morgoth came back and took the field and ended everything in a single catastrophic season. When it cracked, when the tremors of the greatest conflict since the War of Wrath itself reached through the rock and the fire and the walls between the world and the void, and found the lock just slightly less absolute than it had been, and the thing on the other side, the thing that has been pressing against it for 6,000 years, found, for the first time in 6,000 years, a response. This is that story. Part 1: What is in the box? Before you can understand what Morgoth's return would mean for the War of the Ring, you need to understand what Morgoth is. Not what he was at the end of his time in the world, the defeated, chained, crawling figure thrust through the door of night at the War of Wrath's conclusion. What he is at the level of original nature, before the fall, during the fall, after it. The arc is important. The arc is actually the whole point. He began as Melkor. Melkor was the greatest of the Aenir. Tolkien is precise here in the way he is always precise when the precision matters most. Not the greatest of the Aenir who descended into the physical world. Not the greatest of any particular order or category. The greatest, full stop. More gifted than any other spirit in the music before the world was made. More powerful than Manwë, who would become the High King of Arda. More creative than Ale, whose hands shaped the fundamental materials of the world. More knowledgeable than Varda, who kindled the stars. Given more of the gifts of Iluvatar than any other created being, which means he had more of everything: more imagination, more capacity for making, more intelligence, more raw spiritual force. And then he turned. The Ainulindalë, the account of creation at the opening of the Silmarillion, tells us the turn happened in the music itself, before the world had physical form, before the Aenir had descended into it. Melkor introducing themes of his own devising, themes that did not harmonize with Iluvatar's design, themes of pride and self-assertion and the desire to make something that was entirely his own, answerable to no design but his. The turn was not sudden. This is the important thing. It was gradual in the way that all genuine corruption is most effective when the corrupted cannot identify the moment it began. Melkor may not have known at the start that he was turning. The deviation from the harmony may have felt from the inside like composition. By the time the world was made and the Aenir entered it, Melkor was already other than what he had been. Not fully other. The First Age histories show us moments of terrible, dark magnificence in what Morgoth creates through his servants, evidence of a creative intelligence that has not been entirely extinguished, only inverted. But the essential quality of creation in Tolkien's understanding, that it gives itself away, that it makes things for the sake of the things and not for the sake of the maker, that quality was gone. Morgoth's making was always making in service of Morgoth. His gifts were always ultimately about what they gave him. And across the ages of the First Age, as he poured himself into the world in the specific way that Tolkien describes Valar investment, a being of spiritual power pressing his will into the physical substance of what he touches and shapes, his nature became increasingly defined by the investment itself. Not the gifted Ainu who turned, but the embodiment of the turning. Not the darkness that chose itself, but the darkness that had become itself. There is a difference between a person who makes evil choices and an entity that has become evil as a category. Morgoth crossed that line somewhere in the Middle First Age and never crossed back. This is what most discussions of him miss. He is not simply the most powerful villain in Middle-earth's long history. He is something more structural than a villain. He is the principle of the marring of creation, given will, given intelligence, given the specific terrible clarity of purpose that comes from spending your entire existence across all the ages of time committed to a single project. When Tolkien writes that Morgoth's power has been dispersed into the physical substance of Arda, that the corruption of the world is literally made of him, that the darkness is not something he caused but something he is not employing mythology as metaphor. He is making a technical statement about what Morgoth is and what he has done to the world he occupied. Sauron made the One Ring, poured a portion of his will into a physical object, externalized his power, created a vulnerability by concentrating so much of himself in something that could be taken. This was Sauron's error and the mechanism of his eventual defeat. Morgoth did the same thing on the scale of an entire world. He poured himself into Arda, into every orc shaped by the corruption of living elves, every Balrog clothed in fire and shadow from the ranks of Allah's beautiful Maya, every dark place in Middle-earth where the quality of wrongness runs deeper than weather or shadow or mere geography, into the very stone of Angband shaped by centuries of his will. He is in the world in the way that a maker's intention is sometimes still perceptible in the thing made, long after the maker is gone. He was imprisoned, he was never fully absent. The Door of Night is described in the oldest stratum of Tolkien's mythology, a physical gate at the boundary between Arda and the Void, the place where creation ends and the absence of creation begins. Through it, at the War of Wrath's conclusion, Morgoth was thrust. The chain Anger made by Allah specifically for this purpose and used once before put on him again, his feet cut from beneath him, the door sealed, Arundel placed in the sky with the light of a Silmaril to guard against any return. A lock, in other words, on a prison, built by the makers of the world to contain the breaker of it. Locks can be broken. Part 2, 6,000 years of pressure. Here is the thing about the void. There is nothing in it. That is definitionally what the void is, the absence of everything that exists. No time, no matter, no other mind, no sound, no light, nothing for the greatest intelligence that ever entered the physical world to engage with, argue with, reshape, corrupt, or destroy. Nothing to do. Except press. 6,000 years of pressing, not diminishing, not weakening, not resigning itself to permanence. The void does not offer the consolation of distraction, and what was imprisoned there is not the kind of consciousness that has the capacity for acceptance. Morgoth in the void has been doing the same thing for 6,000 years that water does behind a dam, accumulating pressure, finding weaknesses, testing the structure. Not with urgency, because urgency implies that time is working against you, and Morgoth's relationship to time has never been a relationship of consequence, but with the absolute patient implacability of a force that has nowhere to go but forward. The War of the Ring changes the calculation. Not immediately, not dramatically, not with a single catalyzing event that cracks the lock in one violent moment. But consider what the War of the Ring actually is in the metaphysical terms that Tolkien's mythology operates in. The One Ring, made by a Maya whose entire nature was shaped by Morgoth's teaching, forged in the fire of Mordor using principles derived from Morgoth's methods, carrying in its design the logic of total domination that Morgoth pioneered, is active in the world again after 60 years of dormancy at the bottom of the Anduin. Active in the sense of being carried by a bearer, influencing events, pressing against the bearer's will, generating the specific metaphysical disturbance that an object of concentrated dark will generates when it is operating in the physical world. The armies of Mordor are moving across Middle-earth with a destructive force unmatched since the Second Age. Not simply soldiers burning cities, the specific spiritual weight of Sauron's organized darkness in motion across the physical world, pressing on the fabric of things, bending reality toward his purposes. The Nazgul are riding. 9 bearers of rings made in the same craft tradition as the One, 9 former kings hollowed out over centuries until only the wraith of their original selves remains, operating as extensions of Sauron's will through the world's landscape. All of this is vibration. In the specific terms of Tolkien's cosmology, the War of the Ring is the largest single vibration in the fabric of Arda since the War of Wrath, the largest resonance event since the conflict that closed the door in the first place. And a door is only ever as strong as the difference between the pressure behind it and the structural integrity of the lock. The pressure behind it has been building for 6,000 years. The vibration has just reached maximum amplitude. The crack begins. Not visible to anyone standing on the surface of Middle-earth, not audible, not felt by most of the living world's inhabitants as anything more specific than the general sense that the darkness of the Third Age's final chapter is deeper than ordinary darkness, but felt, distantly and with gathering alarm, by the beings whose awareness operates at the level of the world's deep architecture. Felt by Galadriel in Lothlorien, watching the mirror and feeling something at the edge of her vision that has nothing to do with Sauron's armies. Felt by Elrond in Rivendell, waking in the night with a quality of unease that he cannot place. Felt by Círdan at the Grey Havens, standing on his dock looking west with the expression of someone who has received news they were not expecting and cannot yet interpret. Felt most fully and most terribly by the one being in Middle-earth who came back from death with an expanded awareness of the world's deep structure, who was there at Zurichsigil when the crack first became wide enough for a being of his particular attunement to register. Gandalf the White, lying in the snow at the summit of the Silvertine with the Balrog's ashes around him and the clarity of a renewed commission just beginning to settle into his understanding. He feels the crack. And he understands immediately with the full force of 2,000 years of watching the world's deep currents, with the theological clarity that being sent back from death has given him, what it means. Part 3: The Shape of Morgoth. Let us be precise about scale, because the scale is everything. Tolkien is direct in his letters about the comparison between Sauron and Morgoth. He writes of Sauron being lesser than Morgoth, which is accurate in the way that describing the Atlantic Ocean as smaller than the Pacific is accurate, technically true, and almost uselessly understated as a practical guide to what you are dealing with. The Valar, the great powers of Tolkien's mythology, the beings closest to Iluvatar's own authority, were each individually greater than Sauron could ever become, even with the One Ring restored to him. Manwë, whose dominion is the winds and the sky. Ulmo, who is the water itself. Alle, whose craft made the materials of the world before anything was built from them. Orome, the great hunter. Namo Mandos, whose halls hold the dead of every age. Any one of them would have overmatched Sauron in direct confrontation, which is part of why Tolkien's cosmic story has the structure it does. The Valar were deliberately restrained from direct intervention in Middle-earth's fate after the downfall of Númenor, leaving the children of Iluvatar to make their own history. Morgoth was greater than all the Valar individually, possibly greater than several of them combined. Now, apply this to the military realities of the War of the Ring. At Helm's Deep, the alliance of Rohan and Gandalf and the survivors of Edoras defeats the Uruk-hai of Isengard, a genuine victory hard-won near-run dependent on the specific timing of Gandalf's arrival with Erkenbrand's riders. Against a returned Morgoth, Helm's Deep is not a defensible position. It is a collection of people standing on an exposed rock while something the size of a natural disaster moves toward them. At the Pelennor Fields, the combined armies of Gondor and Rohan and the army of the dead defeat the massed forces of Mordor, Harad, and the East. A magnificent victory. Eucatastrophic in the specific sense Tolkien used that word, the unexpected turn toward good that exceeds what calculation could have predicted. Against Morgoth, the Pelennor is a skirmish, an event that will not survive contact with the actual problem by more than an afternoon. At the Black Gate, the army of the West faces Mordor's full remaining force with inadequate numbers, buying time for 2 hobbits inside Mordor. Not a military victory even in intention, a gesture of defiance with the specific courage of people who know they are probably going to die and have decided to die facing the right direction. Against Morgoth, the Black Gate is not even a gesture. It is the kind of thing that is noble and right and will be remembered in stories, and that will accomplish nothing against what is coming. The free peoples of Middle-earth fighting with everything they have, winning through courage and luck and the specific grace that Tolkien calls providence, have zero military capacity against a returned Morgoth. This is not a deficiency they could correct with better strategy or more allies or the right king on the right throne at the right moment. It is a structural fact about the difference in scale between what Morgoth is and what every army that ever marched in Middle-earth can summon. The question this generates, the question that Gandalf is sitting with on the slopes of Zurichsigil, that Galadriel is sitting with in Lothlorien, that Glorfindel in Rivendell knows the answer to from personal experience, is not, how do we fight Morgoth? The question is, what, if anything, closes the door before he comes through it? And the answer, as it turns out, is not an army. It is a ring. Hash part 4, Sauron's impossible position. Nobody in the standard critical literature adequately addresses the following fact about Sauron. He is afraid of his master. Not in the way a subordinate fears a superior who might discipline him for poor performance. In the way that anyone who has spent the First Age in genuine proximity to Morgoth understands at the level of bone and spirit what proximity to Morgoth actually is, what it demands, what it costs, what it leaves you. Sauron served Morgoth with genuine commitment for the entirety of the First Age. Tolkien's accounts and unfinished tales make clear that this was not simple coercion, that Sauron was genuinely formed by his service, that the relationship was formative in the truest sense of the word. Morgoth taught him, gave him access to methods and knowledge he could not have reached independently, made him the most capable servant in the most dangerous army the world had ever seen. But Morgoth's relationship to his servants was not a relationship. It was ownership, complete total without remainder or qualification. What his servants learned, they learned because Morgoth wanted them capable. What his servants built, they built in service of Morgoth's design. There was never a moment in the First Age when Sauron operated from his own judgment in a matter where that judgment conflicted with Morgoth's will. The will that organized everything was Morgoth's, always Morgoth's. And then 6,000 years of independence. 6,000 years of being the most powerful intelligence still operating in the physical world, of making his own decisions, of building Barad-dûr and shaping the rings and engineering the downfall of Númenor, and losing the War of the Last Alliance and rebuilding from near nothing and gathering the darkness again around himself. 6,000 years of being the eye rather than the hand of the eye. 6,000 years of being, in the specific vocabulary of power that Tolkien's mythology uses, his own. It changes something, even in Sauron, even in a being whose fundamental nature was shaped by service and whose entire method is domination. 6,000 years of being the one who dominates builds in him a specific thing that he would never name and barely admits to himself. He does not want to be a servant again. And then Morgoth begins pressing against the door. Sauron feels it through the ring, feels the pressure from the other side, the quality of a presence that he has not felt since before he developed a self independent of that presence. And the first thing he feels, underneath the fear and before the calculation begins, is anger. The second thing is calculation. Because Sauron is nothing if not strategic. Morgoth wants the ring, not because he needs it for power. Morgoth at any point in his history was more powerful than Sauron with ring could ever make him, but because what his servants make belongs to him. The ring is Sauron's greatest work, therefore Morgoth wants it. This is not strategic thinking on Morgoth's part. It is simply the expression of what Morgoth is, a consciousness that cannot conceptualize the existence of a made thing without that made thing being his. Sauron understands this with absolute clarity. If Morgoth returns and Sauron does not have the ring, Morgoth will take it. Sauron will be reduced to the status he occupied for the entire First Age, capable, essential, trusted with execution, and at no point in any meaningful sense free. If Sauron has the ring when Morgoth returns, if the full restoration of his power is complete, if the ring is consolidated in his hand rather than sitting in a hobbit's pocket on its way to be destroyed, there is the thinnest possible edge of a possibility that the relationship could be something other than pure servitude. Not equality. Sauron is not delusional about the gap between what he is and what his master is, but the possibility, barely a possibility, more a direction than a destination, of being something other than simply a tool in a greater hand. This is the most dangerous thought Sauron has ever had. He knows it's dangerous. He knows that Morgoth, 6,000 years in the void, is not coming back in a mood to renegotiate the terms of their relationship. He knows that the idea of using the ring as leverage against Morgoth is, in the cold light of what Morgoth actually is, approximately as sensible as trying to stop an avalanche by standing in front of it and holding out a hand. He calculates anyway, because the alternative, accepting the return of the master without even attempting to arrive at the encounter from a position of strength, is something Sauron's 6,000 years of independence will not permit him to accept without a fight. He accelerates. The hunt for the ring, which was already the organizing principle of his entire strategic effort, becomes something different, more urgent, more desperate, more willing to compromise other objectives in service of the singular priority. The Nazgûl are redeployed. The assault on Minas Tirith, which looks from the outside like the culminating military campaign of the War of the Ring, is also a feint, a diversion of the Free People's attention while the Nine work a different problem with a different urgency. The problem is this: find the ring before Morgoth finds it first. Part 5, what Gandalf knows on the mountain. He lies in the snow. The Balrog's ashes are around him. The sky above Zurichsigil is clear in the specific high-altitude clarity that exists at a height where the ordinary atmosphere of Middle-earth has thinned to something approaching the quality of the air above the world. He is dead, or was dead, or is in the process of coming back from being dead. The categories do not apply cleanly in the space he currently occupies. His name comes back to him gradually. Gandalf. He is Gandalf. He was Olorin before he was Gandalf, and Olorin is who he is again now in a way that Gandalf the Grey never fully was. The constraints of the Grey Commission are gone, dissolved in the act of spending himself entirely in the fight on the bridge and continuing in the fight through the mountain's deeps. What is being sent back is not Gandalf the Grey restored. It is Olorin the Maya wearing the authority he was always supposed to carry and was deliberately asked not to. And Olorin's awareness of the world's deep structure is not Gandalf the Grey's awareness. It is larger, clearer, reaching further down into the architecture of things. What he feels in the first moments of awareness on the summit of the Silvertine is not primarily the physical facts of his condition. The snow, the cold, the ache of a body recently returned to itself. What he feels is the crack. It is not a sensation he has words for in any of the languages he knows, because there is no common language category for the particular quality of the world's fundamental structure developing a flaw. But he feels it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not through any specific sense, through the aggregate of everything that tells you the world is different than it was a moment ago. The door of night is not as closed as it was. Something has been pressing against it from the other side with accumulated force for 6,000 years, and the vibration of the war currently being fought across the surface of the world has found the resonance frequency of the lock's material integrity, and there is, for the first time since the door was sealed, a response from inside. Not passage, not opening. A crack that is, right now, barely perceptible. That will widen if the conditions that created it continue. The conditions that created it are the ring, operating in the world. The concentrated metaphysical force of Sauron's externalized will, active, pressing, amplifying the resonance between the world's fabric and Morgoth's presence in the void. The ring is a child of Morgoth's legacy, not made by Morgoth but made by a being whose entire intellectual framework was Morgoth's teaching, forged with principles Morgoth pioneered, carrying in its design the logic of domination that is Morgoth's fundamental contribution to the world. It vibrates with Morgoth's frequency. It has been vibrating with it for the entire length of the quest. Every day the ring exists and is active is a day the crack widens. Gandalf understands this in the snow at the top of the world. And he understands the corollary: the only thing that closes the crack is the ring's destruction, not its seizure, not its use against Sauron, not its burial or its casting into the deepest water, its destruction, the removal of the vibration source, the silencing of the resonance. And the only place the ring can be destroyed is where it was made. Which means Frodo. Which has always meant Frodo. But now the stakes of Frodo's success are not simply the defeat of Sauron and the liberation of Middle-earth from the shadow of the Third Age's long darkness. The stakes are whether the door at the edge of everything holds long enough for the world to survive into the Fourth Age at all. He gets up, he finds Shadowfax, he dresses in white. And when Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli encounter him in Fangorn Forest, and he says that he comes to them at the turn of the tide, he means this with a precision that they cannot yet fully understand. The tide that turned at Zurichsigil was not simply the military tide of the war. It was the cosmological tide of an age pressing against the boundary between the world and what is outside it. Part 6, the Nazgul and the Old Loyalty. The Nazgul are extensions of Sauron's will. This is their nature, not a metaphor for their function but a literal description of their ontology. They exist because the rings sustain them. The rings are linked to the One. The One is linked to Sauron's will. Therefore the 9 Nazgul are, in the most technical sense available to Tolkien's mythology, distributed fragments of Sauron's attention operating in the physical world through the vehicles of 9 former men. But the Nazgul, like the Balrog of Moria, were not made in the Third Age. The 9 kings who received their rings were given them in the Second Age, and the rings themselves, forged by Celebrimbor under Annatar's instruction, Annatar being Sauron in his fair form, carry in their corrupting power the logic that Sauron derived from Morgoth. The hollowing of the 9 kings across centuries of the ring's use, the reduction of 9 great men to 9 animated pieces of another's will, is ultimately Morgoth's principle working through several removes of inheritance. The Nazgul are connected to Morgoth through Sauron the way grandchildren are connected to grandparents through the parent, not the direct relationship, not the primary bond, but a real inheritance nonetheless. They carry something in the deep structure of what they are that responds to the original source. When Morgoth presses against the door of night, the Nazgul feel it. The Witch King feels it most. He is the most thoroughly integrated into Sauron's will, the most completely made of his service, the oldest and deepest of the nine. He has been operating for 6,000 years as the ultimate instrument of Sauron's agenda. He has not had an independent thought in any meaningful sense of the phrase since the ring finished hollowing him out centuries ago. But what presses through the door of night is not Sauron. It is older than Sauron. It is the thing that Sauron's will is ultimately descended from, the original source, the Maker's Maker, the ground of everything dark that the Third Age contains. And the Witch King, whose entire existence is organized around the instinct for service, whose nature was reshaped by the ring precisely toward the function of serving the greatest available darkness, turns toward it. Not in betrayal of Sauron. The concept doesn't apply to a being of the Witch King's degree of will dissolution. He cannot betray because betrayal requires a genuine self with genuine commitments, and the self that was the Witch King's was extinguished centuries ago. What remains responds to stimuli the way a compass responds to a magnetic field, not by choice but by nature. Sauron is a strong magnetic field. What is pressing through the door of night is a stronger one. The Lord of the Nazgul, leading the assault on Minas Tirith with the full force of Mordor's military might behind him, is fighting Sauron's war. But somewhere underneath the battle's surface, in the dim twilight of whatever the Nazgul have that corresponds to awareness, the orientation is shifting. Not away from Sauron exactly, towards something that is behind Sauron and is making Sauron look, for the first time in 6,000 years, like an intermediate step rather than a final destination. At the Pelennor Fields, Eowyn kills him. Merry's blade destroys the power that held his form together. He dissolves. The canonical account says there is a great cry and a darkness passing away. In this scenario, Eowyn hears something she cannot account for in the moment of his dissolution, and does not speak of until much later, when the houses of healing are quiet and she has had enough recovery to put words to what was wordless in the moment. She heard something that sounded, she says, like relief. As if whatever the Witch King was in his last moments, whatever fragment of awareness remained in the wraith beyond Sauron's direction, found in the dissolution not defeat but release from something that was coming toward him from a direction nobody at the Pelennor was watching. Part 7. Frodo feels the change. He notices it in the Emyn Muil, or in the Dead Marshes, or somewhere on the grey waste between the Anduin and the Black Gates. The timing matters less than the quality of what he notices. The ring has always communicated its nature through dread and weight and the specific persistent gravity of a thing that knows where it wants to go and wants to take you with it. The pull toward Mordor, the pull toward Sauron, the constant low-level suggestion that everything would be simpler if Frodo stopped resisting and let the ring do what it was made for. These have been the ring's modes of communication across the entire length of the quest. Now there is something else underneath them. Not a new pull, not a competing direction exactly, more like a quality of the ring's existing weight becoming more complex, the way a sound can change without changing its pitch just by acquiring harmonics that were not audible before. The pull toward Mordor is still primary, but the ring is no longer pulling from only one source. Frodo notices it the way you notice a change in the weather, not through any single observation but through the aggregate sense that something fundamental has shifted in the environment. The ring's demands have always been Sauron's demands, recognizable by the specific character of his will, directed, purposeful, organized around the single goal of return. What Frodo now feels in the ring's pressure is a second character, older, less organized in any strategic sense. Not directed toward anything as specific as a location. More like gravity than desire, the pull of something massive and patient and completely indifferent to what it is pulling because the thing being pulled is irrelevant to the source. The ring is not being attracted to Sauron the way a homing device is attracted to a signal. It is being attracted to the ground of its own nature, the foundation from which Sauron's methods derived, the original. The ring is afraid. Not of its destruction, it has always been afraid of its destruction, has always pressed against the bearer's will in the direction away from destruction. This is a different fear. The fear of something that recognizes a claim on itself that it cannot answer, that is too fundamental to negotiate, that is prior to any of the agreements and intentions that organized its making. Morgoth does not need the ring, does not need it for power, does not need it for anything a strategic analyst would call a reason. He wants it the way a king wants the things that were made in his kingdom during his absence, not for use, for possession, for the assertion of a claim that was never formally revoked. The ring knows this claim is real, and the ring, which is capable of something like fear in its relationship to its own potential dissolution, feels in this older claim the specific terror of a thing that might be taken before it is even used. Sam watches Frodo stop in the middle of a gray stretch of waste, standing completely still with his hand pressed flat against his chest where the ring hangs, and the expression of someone who is listening to something that has no physical source. "What is it, Mr. Frodo?" Frodo takes a long moment before he answers. When he does, his voice has the quality it acquires when he is reporting something he has no framework for rather than something he understands. "There's something behind Sauron, Sam, something that was there before Sauron. The ring knows it. I can feel the ring knowing it." Sam doesn't know what to say to this. He looks at the gray waste around them, at the distant black shapes of the mountains at the edge of Mordor, at the heavy sky. "Should we go back?" "We can't go back." Frodo's hand closes more tightly against his chest. "And it wouldn't help if we could. Whatever's behind Sauron, going back doesn't put more distance between us and it. The ring is what it's interested in. The ring is what I'm carrying." Sam makes tea. This is what Sam does when there is nothing useful to say and something still needs to be done. He makes tea and hands Frodo a cup and sits close enough that Frodo knows he is not alone. They sit in the gray waste with the ring between them and something ancient pressing from beyond the edge of the world. And Sam thinks about Bilbo's stories and Frodo's stories and all the stories that got them here, and whether the stories had ever mentioned anything about what comes after you defeat the Dark Lord. He doesn't think they had. Part 8. What Galadriel sees. 3 weeks before the ring's destruction, 3 weeks before the crack in the door closes, Galadriel stands at her mirror and sees something she has not seen in 6,000 years of looking into the world's possibilities. She sees what is pressing from the other side. Not clearly, the mirror does not show her Morgoth. What it shows her is the quality of what is coming, the specific character of a darkness that is older and larger than anything in the Third Age's shadow, a will that makes Sauron's organized evil look like a weather pattern, a presence that is not in the world yet but whose gravity is already deforming the shape of the things that are in it. She sits with this for 3 days before she tells anyone. Not from indecision about whether to tell, from the necessary process of integrating what she has seen with everything else she knows, a process that requires time because what she has seen is not information that fits neatly into any existing framework. It is information that requires a new framework. And building a new framework around a fact this large takes 3 days even for Galadriel. When she calls the informal council, Gandalf, Aragorn, Elrond's sons Eladin and Elrohir, she speaks without the elvish circumlocution that council speech sometimes requires. She speaks the way she speaks when the situation has passed the point where measured language has anything useful to offer. "Morgoth is pressing against the door of night *", she says. "I felt it first 3 weeks ago. I have been watching since. The crack is not yet wide enough for passage, but it is widening." The silence that follows has a specific texture, the texture of people who already suspected this and were hoping to be wrong. "How long?" Eladin asks. "If the ring is destroyed, possibly it closes. The ring is the amplifier, the piece of Sauron's will actively operating in the world, creating the resonance that allows Morgoth's pressure to find purchase in the world's fabric. Destroy the ring, remove the amplification, and the crack may simply not have the mechanism to sustain itself. Seal it. And if the ring is not destroyed?" Galadriel pauses. The pause is the length of 3 weeks of calculation arriving at a conclusion she does not want to deliver. "Then the valor must come." The specific weight of these words settles over the people in the room like weather. Everyone present knows what the valor coming to Middle-earth in force means. The last time it happened, Beleriand drowned. An entire continent, the land that the elves had spent an age singing into beauty, the forests and rivers and mountains of the First Age's great stories under the sea. Middle-earth as it exists in the War of the Ring is smaller than it was in the First Age specifically, because the Valor's intervention in the War of Wrath was too large for the geography to survive intact. A second Valor intervention, against a Morgoth who has been in the void for 6,000 additional years of accumulated pressure, in a world already stressed by the War of the Ring. "We do not ask them to come," Gandalf says, "not unless there is no other option. the mission continues. Frodo and the ring are the answer. If they succeed, this conversation never needed to happen. And if they fail, then I will call on Manwë myself, Galadriel says, and whatever is left of Middle-earth when the Valor finish with Morgoth will have to be enough to build something new from. She pauses. I have done that before. We all have. We will do it again if we must. Something passes across her face that none of them have seen there before. Something that is not quite grief and not quite fear, and is both of those things and something older than either of them. The specific expression of someone who has lived long enough to have lost everything they loved once already, and who is looking at the possibility of being asked to survive that particular experience for a second time. But I would very much rather not. Part 9, the Balrog was not accidental. Go back to the bridge of Khazad-dûm. Gandalf plants his staff, you shall not pass. The fire and the shadow confront the Grey Wizard and the Grey Wizard refuses to move. The bridge cracks, the Balrog falls, the whip catches Gandalf's ankle and takes him over the edge with it. This sequence is one of the most analyzed moments in the entirety of Tolkien's Legendarium, and most of the analysis misses what makes it necessary in the context of this scenario. The Balrog of Moria was not simply a powerful enemy obstructing the Fellowship's path. It was an antenna. The Balrogs were made by Morgoth in the First Age from beings of the same Maya order as Gandalf himself, corrupted, clothed in fire and shadow, reshaped by the Master's will into instruments of his specific destructive purpose. They were Morgoth's most direct creation, more thoroughly his than even the orcs, because the orcs were twisted from existing beings, while the Balrogs were the expression of what beings who already belonged to Morgoth became when he turned them fully toward his purpose. Durin's Bane had survived the War of Wrath, the only one to do so, fleeing into the roots of Caradhras while its kin burned and fell under the Valor's assault. 3,000 years of the Second Age and 2,000 more of the Third, sleeping in the mountain's deepest dark, disturbed by the dwarves of Moria, angry, killing their king and king's son in consecutive years, making the mines into what they became. And when Morgoth presses against the door of night from the other side, the Balrog is the only living thing in Middle-earth that feels it as it feels a master's call, not because it receives a transmission or understands a strategy, because it was made of Morgoth's will in a more direct way than anything else still walking in the world, and the pressing activates something in its fundamental nature the way a vibration activates a tuning fork built to respond to exactly that frequency. The Balrog alive and active inside Moria, with the Fellowship having woken it and the War of the Ring beginning to generate the resonance that was cracking the door, the Balrog would have been a second resonance source, a beacon, a channel from inside the world toward the pressure outside it. Every vibration of the War of the Ring would have found in the active Balrog a corresponding vibration amplified and directed, passing through the world's fabric toward the door of night and making the crack wider. This is the deeper reason Gandalf must win on the bridge. Not for the Fellowship's survival, though the Fellowship's survival matters. Not even for the mission's continuation, though the mission's continuation matters more. The Balrog, surviving and responding to its master's calling, would have accelerated the timeline of the door's opening by an order of magnitude. The crack that takes the entire length of the ring quest to reach near critical would have reached it weeks earlier if the Balrog had been alive and active as a second resonance source. Gandalf is Nienna's student, the Maya most associated with pity and the endurance of hope. The being sent to Middle-earth specifically because his core quality, the willingness to carry grief without being destroyed by it, to see the full weight of what is wrong and keep moving anyway, was what the mission required. He faces the Balrog on the bridge not as a soldier following orders, as someone who understands at the level of deep awareness that his renewed commission has opened in him that this particular fight is about more than the people watching it. He wins. He dies. He comes back changed. And the door of night when he returns to Fangorn in white is a little less cracked than it would have been if the Balrog were still alive. Part 10, Aragorn's accounting. The conversation happens after Helm's Deep, in the grey light of a Rohan pre-dawn. Aragorn and Gandalf, Legolas and Gimli, sitting without Theoden or Eomer or anyone who would require the conversation to be translated into terms that did not include its full weight. Gandalf tells Aragorn, not everything at once, the immediate priorities of the war do not yet allow for the luxury of extended reckoning, but the essentials. The crack, the door, what is pressing from the other side. The timeline that makes the ring's destruction not simply the solution to the war, but the specific act that stands between Middle-earth and something that cannot be fought with swords. Aragorn goes very still. This is not a military response. It is not the response of a commander receiving a new threat assessment and beginning to calculate adjusted strategy. It is the response of a man who has been preparing his entire life for a particular version of the responsibility he was born into, and who has just been told that the responsibility is larger than the version. He carries in his blood the full lineage. Isildur and Elendil, Eärendil and Tuor, the survivors of Gondolin and the survivors of Doriath. The line that traces back through every age of the war against the darkness to people who looked directly at Morgoth, not at Sauron, not at Sauron's servants, at Morgoth himself, and chose to fight anyway. He knows the history. He has studied the First Age as operational knowledge, not as ancient legend, because the Rangers of the North were founded on the principle that the past is not past, that what was fought then is connected to what must be fought now. He knows what the War of Wrath cost, he knows what the continent paid. How much time, he asks. That depends on the ring, Gandalf says, if Frodo succeeds. And if he doesn't, then we will need the valor, and we will not like what their presence costs the geography. Legolas, who carries in his woodland realm heritage the memory of the last alliance as lived experience rather than textual record, looks at the sky. Gimli looks at the ground, Aragorn looks at the horizon. The mission, Aragorn says finally, is everything. He says this not as a discovery. He says it in the manner of someone who is reminding themselves of a truth they already knew and need to keep at the center of what comes next. It always was, I know that. Then why, Gimli starts? Because now I know why in a way I didn't before. He looks at Gandalf. Before I understood that destroying the ring would free Middle-earth from Sauron's shadow. Now I understand that failing to destroy the ring would end Middle-earth entirely. Those are different things to carry into a battle. Yes, Gandalf says they are. Does it change the battle? It changes nothing about what must be done, only about the scale of what is permitted to fail. Aragorn nods slowly. The permission to fail in a war with these stakes is 0. He files this away in the part of his awareness that keeps the things that cannot be spoken in council, but that must nonetheless be held clearly in view. He does not share it with Theoden, who needs to fight for Rohan's survival and does not need the additional weight. He does not share it with Eomer, who needs to lead a charge and has enough to carry without carrying this. He does not share it with Merry or Pippin, who are already being asked to do more than hobbits should ever be asked to do. He carries it himself, and he rides to Helm's Deep. Part 11, Sauron's Rebellion. This is the thing that most discussions of Sauron miss. When Morgoth presses against the door and Sauron feels it, feels the weight of his master's presence for the first time in 6,000 years, the specific quality of that overwhelming attention turned toward him from the other side of the world's edge, Sauron does not submit. Not openly, not in a way that any of the war's other participants could detect. Internally, in the private architecture of his own will, he resists. Tolkien's accounts suggest that Sauron's fall was not as complete as Morgoth's, that after the War of the Last Alliance, Sauron lost the fair form he had worn and retreated into a formless shadow, and that in this reduced state something in him moved briefly, imperfectly, incompletely, toward repentance. That the long road back to Barad-dûr and the rebuilding of his power was not simply a villain's recovery plan, but also a being who had glimpsed the emptiness at the core of what he had spent his existence becoming, and who chose to continue anyway because the pride that defined him could not permit the acknowledgement that what he had glimpsed was true. He chose darkness again, but he chose it. That choice matters in Tolkien's moral architecture because it means Sauron is not entirely Morgoth, not entirely the embodiment of the marring, not entirely without the remnant of a self that could have gone differently. And that remnant, the vestigial, buried, almost extinguished part of Sauron that is not purely an extension of Morgoth's original project, is what rebels when it feels the master pressing at the door. Not because it wants the good, it has chosen too fully for darkness to want the good in any genuine sense. But because it wants to be its own dark, not someone else's. 6,000 years of being the eye, the will, the organizing intelligence of the Third Age's shadow, Sauron has become something in that time, something with its own particular character and identity, even if that character and identity are evil. He has preferences, methods, the specific aesthetic of his domination that is recognizably, individually Sauron's rather than a copy of Morgoth's. Morgoth's return would end all of that, would reduce Sauron from the architect of an age to one more instrument in a greater hand. The rebellion is small, silent, invisible to everyone outside Barad-dûr, but it is real and it has a consequence that the war's other participants can observe without understanding. Sauron's forces in the final phase of the War of the Ring fight with a quality of desperation that is not entirely explained by the military situation. The assaults are more relentless than tactical logic requires. The Nazgul's search for the ring takes on a quality of urgency that is different from the cold, patient pressure of the canonical account. The eye, when it turns toward Mordor's interior, turns with a frequency and a focus that is not fully explained by concern about the small figures moving across the plateau of Gorgoroth. Sauron is racing Frodo to Mount Doom, trying to find the ring before it is destroyed. And racing something else. Racing the thing pressing at the door of night, racing his own master. The only strategy available to him in a situation with no good outcomes, be the one holding the ring when the door opens, rather than the one watching his greatest work be carried away by a being who will not regard the distinction between Sauron having built it and Sauron having deserved to keep it. He loses the race. He was always going to lose the race. But the losing is interesting. Part 12 Mount Doom's response. The mountain is different in this scenario. Not in its geography, the Samath nor is where it was, the crack of doom is the crack of doom, the fire below is the same fire in which the ring was made, but in its behavior. Mount Doom in the canonical account is a geological fact serving a metaphysical purpose. The fire in which the ring was made is the only fire that can unmake it, not because of some arbitrary magical rule, but because the making and the unmaking are symmetrical operations, and the ring was made in that fire by that will and can only be undone by the removal of that will from the same location where it was applied. In this scenario, Mount Doom is also a resonance node. The ring was made here. The ring vibrates with Morgoth's frequency through Sauron's medium. Mount Doom, the location of the ring's making, is sensitive to that frequency in the way that a bell is sensitive to the frequency it was made to produce. When Morgoth presses against the door of night and the ring resonates in response, Mount Doom resonates with it. Periodic eruptions of energy that are not volcanic in their origin, that Sam can feel in the ground through his feet as something other than the mountain's ordinary geological processes. The mountain is responding to the door of night. As Frodo and Sam approach up the final slopes, Frodo barely Frodo anymore, reduced by the ring's months of work to something barely held together by the most essential part of himself, which is not ambition or strategy or even hope, but simply the refusal to put down what he has been asked to carry. The mountain's behavior makes the approach more difficult than it should be. The ground is unstable, not from ordinary volcanic activity, from the periodic shuddering of the deep rock responding to pressure transmitted through the metaphysical fabric that connects the ring's making place to the door of night. The sky above Mordor is tearing. The dark clouds that Sauron has maintained over Mordor, his deliberate obscuring of the sky, the shadow that gives his domain its quality of perpetual half-darkness, are being disturbed from above. Not by weather, by something pressing through the upper atmosphere of the world from the space beyond it. Through the tears in the clouds, something that is not exactly light comes through, not the sun. Something whiter than the sun and colder, the light from the other side of the door, visible through the crack that has been widening across the entire length of the quest. Sam looks up at it once, he does not look up again. What the light does to him is not painful and not exactly frightening and is not any sensation he has a name for. It is the specific experience of being seen fully seen, not in the way that another person sees you, in the way that something sees you that is too large to have perspective on, that sees everything simultaneously without distinction or interest, that includes you in its vision the way the sky includes a bird. He is seen. He does not know what is doing the seeing. He looks back down at the slope and focuses on Frodo's weight and the next step. At the threshold of the crack of doom, Frodo claims the ring. The moment is canonical in its structure, the months of carrying, the wearing away of the will that chose to carry it, the final collapse of the ability to make the choice against the ring's full weight at the moment of maximum proximity to its maker. Frodo fails to throw it in, puts it on instead. But what he feels in the claiming in this scenario is different from what the canonical moment contains. He feels Sauron's claim, the surge of the eye turning toward him, the full restored weight of the will that made the ring pressing through the ring into the bearer. The terrible intimacy of a thing that was made by a will finally touching that will again. He feels underneath Sauron's claim the older one. The thing that is pressing from the other side of the door. Not claiming him, it is not interested in him, has no interest in anything so small and specific as a hobbit, claiming the ring. threw the ring into Frodo distantly, impersonally, with the absolute indifference of a claim so old and so fundamental that the ring itself, in the moment of Frodo's claiming it, seems to hesitate between two loyalties. For a fraction of a moment, the space between Frodo's decision and Gollum's arrival, the ring is almost still, almost suspended. Pulled from two directions by two incompatible claims, the immediate and directed pull of Sauron toward whom it was made, and the ancient and impersonal pull of the deeper origin, the ground from which Sauron's methods and the ring's logic ultimately derive. Then Gollum arrives, as mercy shown in a cave 60 years ago destined him to do. The rest is the canonical story. The bite, the ring in the air, the ring in the fire, the cry, the dissolution. Part 13. When the crack closes. The ring's destruction is instantaneous. Tolkien describes the fire consuming it almost as soon as it touches, not a slow melting, not a dramatic forge process working in reverse. The ring was made in that fire with Sauron's will concentrated into it, and the removal of the will, the scattering of Sauron's being to the winds of the world, is the dissolution of the force that held the ring in its shape. Without the will there is nothing to be the ring. Without the will there is only gold returning to fire. And in the same instant the ring goes, instantaneously, simultaneous with the destruction, the resonance stops. The vibration that has been feeding the crack in the door of night for the entire duration of the quest, gone. The amplifying signal that connected Morgoth's pressure to the world's fabric through the medium of Sauron's externalized will, gone. The mechanism by which the crack was widening, the specific condition that made the door of night vulnerable to the accumulated pressure of 6,000 years, gone. In the void, Morgoth is pressing against a door that has stopped responding. The crack does not close instantly, the door of night was not weakened in an instant, and it does not recover in an instant. But without the resonance to sustain it, without the ring's vibration to give Morgoth's pressure the specific frequency it needed to find purchase in the lock's structure, the crack has no mechanism for further widening. It begins to close. Over Mordor, the tiers in the cloud cover, the places where the light from the other side of the door was visible, close. Not immediately. Over the course of minutes, as the door of night's structural integrity reasserts itself without the resonance to undermine it, the light from beyond the world's edge fades. The sky over Mordor is still dark. It will be dark for days more, until Sauron's maintenance of that darkness finishes dissolving with the dissolution of his will. But the quality of the darkness changes. It becomes ordinary darkness. Weather and shadow and the natural consequence of a landscape that has been Sauron's domain for ages, not the pressing, tearing darkness of something trying to come through from the other side. Frodo, lying on the slope with his hand pressed against the place where the ring used to hang and the absence of it more real than most presences he has ever known, opens his eyes and looks up. The sky is changing. Not to blue, not yet. It takes days for the cloud cover to fully dissolve, and the landscape of Mordor in the ring's immediate aftermath is not a landscape of visible light. But the quality of the dark above him is different. The weight that was in it, the specific metaphysical pressure of something enormous pressing down through the atmosphere from the space beyond it, is gone. He knows what this means. He understood enough of what was happening through the ring's communication across the final weeks of the quest to understand what the absence means. Sam he says. Sam has found him, as Sam always finds him. The door, Frodo says, it closed. Sam, who does not know the theological specifics but who has been close enough to Frodo through all of this to have absorbed the shape of what was happening even without the vocabulary for it, looks up at the changing sky and nods. Right, Sam says, good. He pulls Frodo closer against him and they wait for the eagles on the shaking slope, and around them Mordor continues to dissolve into its own aftermath, and somewhere at the edge of the world a door is sealing shut again. Not permanently, not forever. But for now. Part 14, the eagle's second purpose. When Gwaihir descends through the clearing ash smoke and finds Frodo and Sam on the slope of Mount Doom, the canonical story presents this as a rescue. Gandalf called them, they came, this is what the eagles do. But Gwaihir is Manwë's messenger, has always been Manwë's messenger, not merely Gandalf's occasional ally or a convenient transport solution when the plot requires extraction. The great eagles serve the Lord of the Valor as his eyes and hands in the physical world, operating at the intersection of Middle-earth's geography and Valinor's awareness. For the entire length of the War of the Ring, Manwë has been watching the Door of Night, watching the crack develop, watching the resonance amplification that the ring's activity was providing. Making calculations that nobody in Middle-earth was party to, about the point at which valor intervention would become necessary, about what that intervention would cost, about the specific conditions under which the Door of Night's integrity could be preserved without resorting to the geography-destroying force of a second War of Wrath. The eagles posted nearest the world's edge, maintaining the vigil that Eärendil had held at the beginning and that had been maintained in various forms across the centuries, reported the change in the door's condition within hours of the ring's destruction. The resonance had stopped. The crack was closing. The mechanism for further widening had been removed. When Gwaihir descends toward Mount Doom, he is carrying two purposes. The first is Gandalf's request: find Frodo and Sam, bring them out before the eruption takes them. The second is Manwë's: verify, see with the Lord's messenger's eyes that what the vigil reported is true, that the resonance is gone, that Mount Doom's volcanic behavior is returning to ordinary geological patterns, that the light from the other side of the door has stopped coming through the tears in the clouds. He picks up Frodo and Sam, he checks the mountain's behavior, he flies. In Valinor, Manwë receives the report. The door is closed. The emergency is over. Something happens in Valinor that has not happened since the War of Wrath's aftermath, a releasing of attention that has been maintained at maximum alertness for months, a standing down of the specific vigilance that the Door of Night's cracking had required, not celebration. The Valar are not beings for whom crisis resolution produces celebration, in part because they understand too clearly that resolution is always provisional and crisis always recurs. But the specific quality of sustained alarm, the background computation running in every Valar's awareness that said the next few weeks might require direct intervention in the physical world and the costs that would come with it, that goes quiet. For the first time since Sauron recovered the ring's location, Middle-earth is not a world on the edge of something catastrophically irreversible. It is merely a world on the edge of rebuilding. Part 15, What the Paths of the Dead Know. The army of the Oathbreakers, the dead men of the White Mountains who broke their oath to Isildur and have been paying for it for 3,000 years in the twilight existence between the living world and whatever is on the other side of death. 3,000 years in that twilight. 3,000 years of whatever the dead experience when they are held by an unresolved oath to a dead king's house, existing in the overlap between being here and being elsewhere, seeing the living world through the membrane that separates the dead from the living. What do you know, after 3,000 years in that liminal place, about what is on the other side of things? What can you feel with the specific permeability of the dead to pressures that the living experience only as vague unease, when something on the far side of existence begins pressing against the walls? When Aragorn rides into the paths of the dead and the King of the Dead stands before him in the darkness. The exchange between them has the quality it has always had in the canonical account, the heir of Isildur claiming the fulfillment of the ancient oath, the dead king's recognition of the authority, the release. But before the release, before Aragorn makes his claim, the King of the Dead says something. The old darkness is stirring. Not as information Aragorn doesn't have, as confirmation of information he does. As something the dead know through their 3,000 years of liminal existence and want to register with the last heir of the king they failed before the debt is finally paid. Aragorn does not stop, does not ask for elaboration, nods once acknowledging what the dead king has confirmed rather than revealed and delivers his claim. But riding out of the paths of the dead at the head of the army of the Oathbreakers, he feels the specific weight of what the dead king's words added to everything else he is already carrying. The dead of the mountains felt the pressing at the door, the dead of 3,000 years of liminal existence, sensitive to pressures that the living cannot feel, know that what is happening on the edges of the world is different from the ordinary darkness of the Third Age. The army of the dead that follows Aragorn down from the mountains and breaks the Corsair fleet at Pelargir has a quality that the soldiers at the river sense before they understand it. Not simply the terror of the unquiet dead, something older, something that has been sitting in the twilight between death and continuation for 3,000 years, and that has felt in those 3,000 years what moves on the other side of things. Aragorn, standing on the prow of the turned ship looking north toward Minas Tirith, draws Anduril and holds it. The blade is Isildur's heir's blade, the blade that was used to cut the ring from Sauron's hand at the end of the Second Age. The last time someone carrying this bloodline stood at the hinge between an age's continuation and its ending. He sheathes it. There is a battle to win first, there is always a battle to win first. Part 16, Glorfindel's account. There is one being in Rivendell who has done something that nobody else alive in Middle-earth has done. Who faced a direct servant of Morgoth in individual combat, not Sauron, not a ring-wraith, a Balrog of Morgoth's own making, a Maya clothed in fire and shadow, a being of the same original nature as Gandalf, fallen into the service of the First Darkness. Glorfindel of Gondolin, who killed his Balrog on the clifftop above the city's fall and went over the edge with it, whose body was carried by Thorondor to a burial place in the mountains, who was reincarnated in Valinor and sent back to Middle-earth in the early Third Age. The same Glorfindel who met Frodo at the ford of Bruinen. Most readers of Tolkien do not know this. Tolkien himself wrestled with it across decades of unpublished revision before settling, near the end of his life, on yes, same person. The golden-haired elf lord of Rivendell and the golden-haired elf lord who died above Gondolin are the same individual 5,000 years apart. Which means that Glorfindel died in direct combat with a creature of Morgoth's making, was considered important enough to Arda's history that the Valar reincarnated him and sent him back, and has been in Middle-earth since the early Third Age with the specific knowledge of someone who has been to Valinor recently, 3,000 years ago in cosmic terms, and who sat in the Blessed Realm while the Valar were still processing the War of Wrath's aftermath. He knows things from the source that everyone else knows from texts. When Gandalf and Aragorn need an account of the Valar's position on a Morgoth return, not what the lore says, what the Valar actually believe, what their plan is, what the theology of intervention looks like from the perspective of someone who sat in those halls and watched those faces, the person they go to is Glorfindel. In a private room in Minas Tirith, in the window between the Pelennar's aftermath and the march to the Black Gate, Glorfindel tells them what he knows. They are not passive, he says. He speaks in the manner of someone reporting observed fact rather than filtered through the literary tradition of Elvish counsel. Manwë watches the door of night, the eagles maintain the vigil. If the door cracks far enough, the response will be direct. What kind of direct? Aragorn asks. Glorfindel looks at him. The eyes of someone who has died once in service of a cause and came back understand what service costs in a way that people who have not died cannot fully access. The kind that reshapes the geography. The silence. There is one other thing, Glorfindel says, the prophecy, Turin Tir-Rambar, the wielder of Gurthang, the First Age's greatest mortal warrior who is in the halls of Mandos with all the other dead of the elder days who have not been released. He pauses, the dagger Dagorath, the last battle. In the prophecy, Turin rises to strike the final blow against Morgoth. Turin is dead, Aragorn says. He is in Mandos. The release of the First Age dead is Iluvatar's choice, not the Valar's. Glorfindel pauses again. But if the last battle were coming earlier than anyone anticipated, if the conditions of the dagger Dagorath were arriving in the Third Age rather than at the end of all things, there is a question of whether the appeal could be made. By whom? By the one person in history who made the journey to Valinor while living and interceded with the Valar on behalf of both kindreds. Glorfindel's eyes are steady. Your ancestor, Aragorn, Eärendil, who is the morning star now, who sails the sky, who has a voice if the world's need reached him with sufficient clarity. The option sits in the room. Neither Aragorn nor Gandalf speaks to it directly. It is the last resort beyond the last resort, the appeal to a level of the mythology's machinery that no one can compel to respond, that depends entirely on a grace that is not earned but given. Aragorn files it, in the place where impossible options are kept until they become the only options remaining. He hopes very much that it does not come to that. Part 17, the Black Gate speech. The canonical speech is about the courage of the small army, the acknowledgement of the odds, the permission given to those who wish to turn back. In this scenario, the speech has a dimension that the canonical version cannot contain, because in this scenario, the men assembled before the Black Gate, Eomer and the riders of Rohan, the captains of Gondor, the rangers of the north, Elladan and Elrohir, Glorfindel himself, the commanders know, not the full soldiers, not every person in the ranks, but the commanders know what the closed door depends on, know that the army before them is not attempting a military victory, is attempting a distraction. Aragorn stands before them on his horse with Anduril Bear. He says, "We are small, we know this. The enemy in front of us is larger than we are and we know this too. There is no lie I could tell you today about our military situation that would make it better than it is, so I will tell you the truth instead." He pauses, the wind moves over the flat gray plain before the Black Gate. Two of the smallest people I have ever known are moving through the dark of Mordor right now, carrying the thing that ends this war. They don't need us to win, they need us to hold Sauron's attention for as long as we can stand. They need his eye looking here instead of looking there. That is everything we are doing today, looking dangerous, drawing the eye, buying time. He looks at the assembled army, at the faces of men who have been fighting since Helm's Deep, who have buried friends in the Pelennar's mud, who rode here knowing the odds because the alternative was letting the thing that needed doing fail for want of a distraction. There is something behind the enemy in front of us, he says, something older and larger than any army. Against that thing, this army is not a military force. We are a witness. We are the free peoples of Middle-earth saying, with our bodies and our flags and our refusal to stay home, not yet, not today, not while there is still a chance. He raises Anduril. Hold the eye as long as you can, that's all, hold the eye. He could not say this in the canonical story. In the canonical story, the commanders do not know. In this scenario, they do. And there is something in the manner in which they ride to the Black Gate, the specific quality of people acting with full knowledge of the context rather than heroic ignorance of it, that is different from the canonical march. Both are brave. The second is braver, in the specific way that it is braver to do the right thing when you know exactly what you are up against than to do it in the mercy of not knowing. The gate opens. The armies come out. The last stand begins. And in the dark of Mordor, far away, 2 feet slip on gray ash. Part 18, what did not come through? The door held. This is the end of the scenario, and it is worth sitting with in its full particularity. The door held not because it was indestructible. Tolkien never described it as indestructible. It held because the specific chain of events that was cracking it was broken at the critical link. Trace it back. If the Balrog of Moria had survived, had Gandalf not been there, or had the bridge held and the Balrog escaped back into the mountain's depths, the Balrog would have been a second resonance source, a beacon responding to Morgoth's frequency from inside the world. The crack in the door would have widened at twice the speed. The timeline would have been shorter. Frodo would not have reached the fire in time. If Frodo had faltered earlier, at Weathertop, or at the ford, or in the dark council of his own mind on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, the ring would have come to Sauron with his full power restored, and Sauron with the ring was not something that could be contained by any force the Free Peoples could muster. The door would not have cracked on this timeline. It would have been opened from the inside, by a Sauron with ring attempting to use the ring as leverage against a returning master, and the result of that internal conflict between Morgoth and Sauron with ring would have destroyed whatever the conflict was fought on. If Sam had kept the ring for 1 more hour in the Tower of Cirith Ungol, if the gardener's vision of a great kingdom had deepened in that hour from pleasant fantasy to genuine desire, Sam would not have given it back. And without Sam giving it back, Frodo does not reach the fire. If Gollum had been killed at any point in the long journey between Bilbo's cave and the Crack of Doom, if the mercy shone in the dark of the Misty Mountains 60 years before the War of the Ring had not been shown, if Bilbo had made the other choice in that moment, if any of the multiple attempts on Gollum's life that occurred during the quest had succeeded, the ring would have been claimed at the fire's edge and not destroyed. Every link held, some of them by the smallest possible margin, some of them by choices made by beings who had no knowledge of what depended on the choice. Bilbo's mercy, given in darkness to a creature he had no reason to spare, not knowing it would be the mechanism of the world's survival. This is Tolkien's deepest point. And the door is closed. Morgoth is in the void, he is not gone, he will not stop pressing. The void offers him nothing but the accumulated pressure of 6,000 years and the knowledge that the world he poured himself into is still there, still marred with what he made it, still containing in its deep structure the marks of what he was and what he did. But the conditions that made the door vulnerable are removed. The ring is gone. The Balrog of Moria is gone. The specific resonance that was amplifying Morgoth's pressure against the lock's structure gone. Without the resonance, the door's integrity reasserts. Without the ring's vibration, the crack closes. Not permanently, not as final resolution, as the provisional state that every age's ending achieves. The world goes on. Part 19, what Aragorn builds. The Fourth Age is the canonical reign of Elessar, restoration of Arnor, the renewal of Gondor, the long peace, the greatest achievement of any king since the Second Age. In this scenario, the Fourth Age has a dimension underneath the canonical achievements. It knows. Not publicly. Aragorn does not gather the people of Gondor and Rohan and the free folk, and explain to them that during the War of the Ring the Door of Night was cracking and Morgoth was pressing against it. This information shared broadly produces one of two useless results: existential paralysis that prevents the rebuilding the age requires, or false relief that the danger has passed permanently and will never recur. Both are wrong. Both would damage the work. What Aragorn builds instead is institutions. Laws and governance and the structures of civil society that are the Fourth Age's answer to the question of how a world survives what it has survived and remains capable of surviving what comes next. Libraries where what happened in the Third Age is recorded not as legend but as operational history. Diplomatic relationships with former enemies that transform neighbors who were enemies into neighbors who are merely neighbors. And in the deepest layer of the institutional structure, something that has no formal name in the Fourth Age's records. A watch. Not of the horizon or the borders or the military threats that conventional defense addresses. A watch of the sky, of the light that comes from beyond the world's edge when the conditions are wrong. A watch of the stories maintained by people who know the lore of the First Age's operational knowledge, who understand who Morgoth is, what the Door of Night is, what the Dagger Dagorath prophecy says about how the mythology ends, who would recognize the signs if the signs came again and know what needed doing. Faramir designs it. He is the best mind in Gondor after Aragorn himself, the scholar-soldier who read the lore of the First Age in the library of Minas Tirith before the war because he understood that the past was not past. He builds the watch without nomming it, embedding it in the normal functions of scholarship and governance and record-keeping, making it sustainable across generations that will not themselves have lived through the War of the Ring. The watch's founding principle, as Faramir articulates it to the small circle who know what it is for. Know what the world is, not because it will frighten you, because it is the foundation for wise action. Know the darkness at the edge of things so that when the signs appear again you recognize them as signs rather than weather. Know the Door of Night so that when it cracks again you know what the cracking means. Know Morgoth so that when the next age's equivalent of the ring appears, the next resonance amplifier, the next mechanism for widening the crack, you know to destroy it rather than keep it. Aragorn rules for 66 years, dies in the manner of the Númenórean kings, laying down his life when the flame of his vitality has run its course rather than allowing it to flicker into diminishment. He dies knowing that the door held. He dies knowing that what he built is good. He dies knowing that the door will crack again eventually, and that when it does, what he built will give the next generation the same thing that the free people's courage and mercy and improbable luck gave his, a chance. Let us say plainly what Tolkien was building underneath the story. He was a Catholic scholar who worked in the tradition of Northern European mythology and who understood with the full force of both backgrounds that the honest answer to the question of what lies at the edge of things is not reassuring. Northern mythology does not offer reassurance about the darkness at the edge of reality. It offers courage in the face of that darkness, the specific courage that proceeds not from confidence in victory but from the conviction that the right action is right regardless of the outcome. And the Catholic theological tradition that ran underneath everything Tolkien built offered something different and complementary: the conviction that the marring of creation is not the final word, that what was made good and has been marred can, in the fullness of what lies beyond the circles of the world, be made new. Morgoth in the Void is the point at which those two traditions meet in Tolkien's mythology. He is what the Northern tradition says about the darkness at the edge of things. It is real, it is old, it is larger than any human force can address, and it is waiting. The Door of Night is a lock, not an absence. What is behind it is what was behind everything the Third Age fought against: the original principle of the marring, the choice that chose itself over creation's gift, the will that turned inward at the beginning of everything and has been defining itself by that turn ever since. And he is what the Catholic tradition says about that darkness: contained, imprisoned, not free. The prison is not permanent. The Dagger Dagorath prophecy says the door opens eventually, and Tolkien never fully repudiated that prophecy, but the prison is real and has held for 6,000 years and will hold for ages more. The War of the Ring almost cracked the door. The specific resonance conditions, the ring active in the world, the Balrog operating as secondary beacon. The war's metaphysical violence providing the vibration, brought the crack to near critical in a way that had not happened since the door was sealed. And the crack closed because a hobbit threw a ring into a fire. Not because of power, because of the specific absence of the will to power, the willingness to destroy the most powerful object in the world rather than use it, to give the world what it needed rather than take from the world what it could offer. The decision, made in the dark at the root of an evil mountain by a being so small that the eye had never looked directly at him, to let the thing go. This is what holds the door. Not the Valor's vigilance, though the Valor's vigilance is real and essential. Not the armies of the West, though the armies of the West are real and their courage is genuine and their sacrifice matters. Not the wise counsels of Rivendell and Lothlorien, though the wisdom in those counsels shaped the conditions that made the right choice possible. The door holds because ordinary people in specific moments make the choice that does not calculate. The mercy in the cave, the loyalty on the mountain, the refusal to put down what has been asked to be carried. These are the same kind of choice, made without knowledge of their full significance, made from love rather than strategy, made by beings who are, by every measure the darkness uses to assess threat levels, completely irrelevant. That irrelevance is the point, has always been the point, is the most important structural feature of the mythology, the thing Tolkien built into the bones of the world he made. The eye sees armies, the eye sees rings, the eye sees power. The eye does not see hobbits. And the door of night does not hold against the darkness of 6,000 years of accumulated pressure through military valor or divine intervention or the right king on the right throne. It holds because a small person who wanted to go home chose, when given the chance, to give the world what it needed instead of taking what he was offered. The ship sails. Certain on his dock, as he has stood on docks since before the world had a sun, watching the vessel become a shape in the water and then a smaller shape and then the light of a Silmaril on the western horizon and then nothing. Gandalf is aboard. He who was Olorin before he was Gandalf is going home, to the gardens of Ermo, to the house of Nienna where he learned the lesson that made everything else possible. Not grief as the last word but endurance. Not the dark at the edge of things as the defining fact of existence, but the light that has been kept, however imperfectly, in the face of it. He knows what almost happened. He has known since Zurich-Sigil. He carries it the way he has always carried the large things, with the patience of someone whose teacher was the Lady of Mercy, who learned to look at the wound directly and keep moving. He carries it onto the ship and away. The world of men begins. Not a world without the door of night. The door is there as it always was, as it will always be until the dagger Daggorath. Morgoth is behind it as he always was, as he will always be. The darkness at the edge of things is as dark as it ever was. But the world of men begins with the institutional memory of what the world is, with the watch that Faramir built, with the stories that Sam Gamgee will tell his children and that his children will tell theirs, not just the adventure stories, the stories that carry in them the understanding that small acts of mercy and loyalty have consequences that no strategic calculation can predict. The door held this time because the chain of choices held. The chain held because the choices in it were made by people who were, by every metric of power, nothing. The world goes on because nothing, specifically, lovingly, stubbornly, in full ignorance of its own significance, chose the right thing at the right moment. This is what Tolkien was saying. This has always been what Tolkien was saying. The door is locked. For now the door is locked. And in the Shire, Sam Gamgee is planting a tree. The darkness at the edge of things is real. The door is a door, not a wall. What holds it is not strength. What holds it is the willingness of small people to give the world what it needs, without asking what the world will give them back. That has always been enough. That is all it has ever been. Go plant something.